morning, everybody. And it's great to be here. It was enjoyable to be with you all at that panel discussion yesterday. And like Matt said, we're going to go into a little more detail on some of the things that we did touch on yesterday. So I'll give you an overview of some things going on in Washington, and at least one person's perspective on BRAC rounds in particular. And then, if there's time for a couple of questions, I'd be happy to take that. I know we also have another panel that will be convening up here on the issue of local governments before we have our first break. So I'm flexible. I'll just work with whatever works best for everybody here. So I'd like to do two things. And then first thing is I'll offer some perspective on BRAC from a member of the Armed Services Committee. And then second, like Matt said, I'll talk about the defense budget in general. Congress has already authorized 5 BRAC rounds since 1988, as you may know. And this allowed for the closure or realignment of over 100 defense facilities throughout the U.S. These previous 5 rounds consisted over 1,000 individual actions. But right now, I personally am not convinced that another BRAC round is in the country's national security interest, or that we can even afford it. An overwhelming bipartisan majority of my colleagues on Armed Services Committee currently agree on this. For me, the issue comes down to strategic capacity, cost, and trust. And we did touch briefly on these things that I did and the other panelists. Different perspectives from the members of the panel, but my perspective is as follows. And I'll go into more detail than what we were able to cover yesterday. First, on strategic capacity. When you look at the threats our country faces, we already have a huge mismatch between strategy and resources. As you know, America faces a complex and volatile array of threats in today's post-Cold War world, from ISIS and Al-Qaeda to North Korea and Iran to Russia and China. What all of these threats have in common is that they are not confined to single regions of the world. They span multiple regions and domains of military activity. We can no longer assume that we will have the advantage everywhere. We cannot and should not debate installation capacity apart from the broader context of the debate regarding what our national security strategy should be and what force structure or end strength we need to resource any strategy that we may have. The unfortunate reality that we've seen under this administration, however, is doing things backwards, in my opinion. Coming up with a limited budget number first, and then letting DoD figure out a strategy that they can afford based on those massive fiscal constraints. I think we should instead do things in the opposite order. Start with figuring out what strategy makes sense, and then decide what funding and resources DoD needs to execute a strategy that actually meets our national security needs. In the context of our larger security strategy, the unfortunate thing about the BRAC process is that once an asset is lost, it might be impossible to regain, or at least prohibitively expensive to replace. Given the growing security challenges around the world, I'm concerned that it might be reckless to divest assets that we could need in the future. Have we thought enough about our role in the world, the kind of military capability we need to fulfill that role, and what sort of basing is therefore needed to sustain that military capacity? Have we worked our way through all the steps necessary so that someday we don't come back and say, gosh, we shouldn't have gotten rid of that training range after all? In such a volatile world, we need to be cautious about giving away military capacity. Second, one big downside to BRAC is the upfront cost. Ironically, the whole point of doing another BRAC round is presumably to save money, and yet it also happens to be expensive. We have to spend money now to save it later. If DoD's latest estimates are correct, and I'll get to some issues with that in a minute, we wouldn't start saving money until 6 years after the BRAC was initiated. And after that, we would save around $2 billion a year. That's a lot of money, but it's actually, as I pointed out yesterday, less than 0.5% of the DoD budget. So that won't solve a lot of fiscal problems. The need for significant, lasting defense reform is clear, and BRAC is just one part of the overall reform conversation. As long as budgets stay tight, as they are now and seem likely to remain, DoD must make smarter and better use of its resources. But we also need to remember that reform cannot take the place of sufficient, predictable funding. We simply must spend more on defense. Also, giving the Pentagon more certainty in their planning processes is one of the best things we can do to prevent waste and inefficiency. Meanwhile, back to the cost of BRAC. Some people don't realize that we're still paying for the 2005 round today. We haven't even broken even yet. 10 years later, it has still cost the taxpayers more money than it has saved, and that'll probably be the case for the next 3 years. This gets to some big problems with how DoD does its cost estimates and how they did their estimates the last time around. The last round cost almost 70% more, or $14 billion more than they initially estimated. Now with $14 billion, you could buy 165 F-35s, or you could pay for the sustainment of 49 Army brigades for a year. That's a lot of money. So this brings me to my third issue with BRAC, and that is trust. DoD claims that the Army and Air Force have 18 and 30% excess infrastructure, respectively, yet we have not seen any of this analysis. We haven't seen a shred of data or any specifics to support this. The only data that we have are from the last BRAC round, which is more than 10 years old. So on the trust issue, when you look at how much authority the BRAC process delegates to the President and to the Department, and you take that in the context of all of the other trust issues that Congress has with President Obama on a myriad of issues, as well as some issues between Congress and the DoD, given how poorly the last round was executed, you can begin to understand why my colleagues and myself have specifically prohibited a new BRAC round in each of the last several defense bills. Now, by the way, it's a little known fact, but the President actually already has a lot of authority to close bases outside of the BRAC process, but he chooses not to exercise this authority. No legislation is needed to close a military base. Congress has to be notified if a certain number of jobs are involved, but that's about it. Anyone who is around for the last BRAC round is quick to point out that the process itself does need a lot of improvement. If we had better information and if we could be confident in the process itself from estimation to completion, such as its accuracy, rigor, integrity, and objectivity, it would make the decision a lot easier. That's exactly why this year's defense bill directs a new capacity study to help Congress better understand which areas the department believes there is excess capacity and opportunities in to achieve efficiencies. We did touch on that in the panel yesterday. This study will start with a threat assessment and force structure plan, and then using conservative assumptions about future end strength as well as a categorical inventory of worldwide military installations, look at what infrastructure we need, including contingency, mobilization, or surge requirements. The provision also requires the Comptroller General to independently evaluate the accuracy and analytical sufficiency of the plans and inventory. This assessment, which will be submitted along with the President's budget request next February, will give us some more specifics to help Congress make informed decisions going forward. So I do look forward to that study being completed. So that's some perspective on BRAC. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the defense budget in general. I'd like to touch on where we've been as well as where we might be headed. But first, a quick note about the recent budget deal and how it impacts defense spending for fiscal year 16. Congress originally passed the NDAA in early October. We had done it much earlier in the House. That was the Senate doing their job in October, only to have President Obama veto the bill because he wanted more money for non-defense spending. He vetoed the bill because of things that were not in the bill. This led to a budget deal in late October, which unfortunately gave the President extra non-defense spending, but also decreased defense spending by $5 billion this year. All of the policy provisions in the NDAA are intact. And this new version, minus the $5 billion, has passed both houses of Congress by overwhelming majorities. The White House said this week that it will sign the bill. Defense appropriations should follow the NDAA relatively easily in the next month. So while I'm glad to have certainty for defense spending this year, the $5 billion cut is ill-advised and is unfortunate. The first bill that was originally passed and then vetoed contained the no-kidding bare minimum funding level. The $5 billion that we have to cut further now will be spread around over more than 100 programs, and there are some tolerable steps like $1.1 billion in lower fuel costs, given the lower price of gasoline and jet fuel, and other money that couldn't be spent due to evolving circumstances like delays in planning out the long-range bomber. But there are also some pretty concerning cuts. For instance, $443 million less for Army readiness. $250 million of that is for the Army itself, $192 million of that is for Army National Guard. And of course, other programs were dinged as well. Now, there are many ways to try to measure or understand how much we spend on defense. First, how do we understand $607 billion in the first place? To put it in perspective, according to the National Retail Foundation, last year Americans spent more on winter holidays, $616 billion, than we spent on national defense. And another interesting fact, Americans spent more on Mother's Day gifts, nothing wrong with that, $21 billion, or almost as much as on the entire U.S. Marine Corps, $24 billion. But the overall dollar amount we spend on defense is very important, but let's look at it in a historical context. Here it's helpful to look at defense spending as a share of GDP and as a share of overall federal spending. Since World War II, we've spent an average of 5.5% of our GDP on defense during wartime and 5% during peacetime. During this time period, we've seen big drawdowns after Vietnam, at the end of the Cold War, and since Barack Obama came into office since 2010. I want to compare the Clinton drawdown in the 90s to the current drawdown. And I think General Anderson mentioned some of this yesterday. In both cases, we cut defense spending from 5%, which remember is our historical peacetime average since World War II, down to 3%. With a $17 trillion economy, a 2% cut is a very real national defense risk. In the Clinton era, we had the fall of the Soviet Union to at least give an argument for cutting defense. What's the comparable sea change today to give us that kind of assurance? President Obama has cut the military while the world has become more dangerous. Even worse, under the president's budget, the trend continues downward over the next 5 years, leaving us spending only 2% of our GDP on the military if he has his way. We haven't seen a level that low since the 1930s. Meanwhile, defense spending is also shrinking as a portion of overall federal spending. Since Vietnam, we spent an average of 21% of the federal budget on defense. Today, we spend well below that, roughly 15% of the pie. And here, too, the trend only gets worse in the future. Beyond the desperate need to reverse the overall downward trend in defense spending, however, it's important to note that certain areas of the defense budget do remain well positioned for growth. I know everyone here is not from Colorado Springs, but when I talk about where our nation's future defense needs are headed, I can't help but point out what amazing assets we have here in Colorado Springs. When I brought out Armed Services Chairman Mac Thornberry to visit our military bases earlier this year, he put it very strongly, saying, actually this was late last year, saying Colorado Springs is the future of defense. Our last committee chairman, Buck McKeon, had a similar impression when I brought him out, as did Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee Chairman Joe Wilson, who visited the Springs this last August with me. All of the mission areas we excel at here in the Springs, space, cyber, and missile defense, are ones that will grow in the years to come. We simply must figure out how things like that can be protected. Like, how do we protect our satellites from growing threats from our near peers? How can we have survivable, persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance? And how can we get ahead and stay ahead of ballistic missile threats? Those issues are not going away. They're going to be with us and become more important. In all of these areas and more, DoD is increasingly looking for companies that can help provide agile, innovative solutions. There are some other expensive priorities that the department needs to do as well, probably first and foremost of which is modernizing our nuclear enterprise. Now, Yogi Berra once said, "I don't like to make predictions, especially when it involves the future." Still, the defense and aerospace community in the Springs and beyond is in a prime position to grow and enhance the incredible value that we provide to the warfighter. Our defense and aerospace industries not only matter to the warfighters, but they matter to the state of Colorado in enormous ways. Defense is the third largest sector in Colorado's economy with $27 billion of economic impact. Here in El Paso County, there are over 225 companies that work in defense and aerospace, supporting 107,000 jobs and $13 billion of economic impact. So to conclude, while I don't think that right now is the time for a new round of BRAC, that can always change in the future. But regardless of whether and when there is a future round of BRAC, however, there are always exciting growth opportunities, and here I think the future of Colorado and Colorado Springs is particularly bright. So that's why a forum like this can be so useful. It's an opportunity for the community to better understand how to help the military and their families, and for the military to better understand how it can help the community. Colorado already has some of the strongest and deepest relationships you can find anywhere, but we can always improve. We need to continue to work together to ensure that our brave men and women in uniform are ready to answer the nation's call in a time of need. So thank you for letting me be here this morning, and I look forward to any questions that we might have before the next panel takes place. Mayor Suthers.
Doug, I don't want to beat to death this disconnect between the Pentagon and the Congress about BRAC, but several of us in this room were at the Pentagon the first weekend we met with you back in D.C. We spent the morning with the Army and the afternoon with the Air Force. And the one very consistent message we got from everybody was, we need a BRAC. And I think Don, you were there. I think I have a pretty good radar when someone is just spouting a party line, you know, that, hey, this is the president's line and I'm just spouting it. I felt like they were very sincere about it. And these were people that, know the military installation situation. So it's I'm a little concerned that you and your committee are obviously on one wavelength and the alleged experts in the Pentagon are on a different wavelength. Other than this party line deal, what could explain that?
Okay, and Jen also brought that up yesterday. That's a great question, John. And I think that there is a lot of sincerity when you talk to people in the Pentagon. There is a little bit of the element of that's the message being handed down and everyone needs to go with that. But there is also some sincerity. There's no question about it. That's one of the things that would help. But like I said earlier, the president and the DoD can close bases right now. They can shift assets around. You can do a soft BRAC by repositioning assets. If there's a base somewhere out in the boondocks that's not useful currently, it doesn't have to be fully staffed. You know, the staffing can change. Airframes, Army units can change. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility right now that the Pentagon has and the administration has. They like the cover of Congress being signed on to agree ahead of time, which is what you do with BRAC. You agree you're not going to amend, or you vote all up or all down. But also, they don't want to be second guessed if they make an unpopular decision and everyone gets up in arms and overrides a veto or has overwhelming opposition to it. then they have to start all over, and people have egg on their face. So they don't want that either. So they would like Congress to be involved, but it doesn't have to be that way. The commander-in-chief has tremendous powers. So, but also BRAC is something that people kind of have control over, and whereas the future of the budget is, the Pentagon has less control over that. So I think there's more trepidation about taking that on, because how do you take on the crying need for more funding? And I think we all in this room agree we need more funding. And when it's laid out for us, like I just laid out, or General Anderson or others lay out, we need more funding for defense. But the Pentagon can't really solve that one. But doing BRAC is doable. That's something within their wheelhouse, you might say. So be that as it may, I'm going to work on the issue of more funding. I'm going to take this message, not just to you, I'm preaching to the choir here when I say this to you, but when I go to my colleagues, some of which, both Republican and Democrat, don't always see the need for more defense spending. They have their own priorities. They have other things they're more in tune with, perhaps. So I see a need to go to my colleagues and convince them that we have to have more defense spending, or the general public. And we all can do that, but I'll certainly be part of that. So while BRAC is important, John, and what they tell you, they're sincere about, we also have to work on what I think are the bigger issues of the overall level of defense spending. BRAC itself, with a $2 billion savings, is 0.5 of 1%. That's important, but we have a lot bigger needs than just that. Yeah, Mark.
Congressman Lamborn, I'm Mark Volchev, Military Affairs Council. Sir, I appreciate you being here today, and love your idea about building the strategy first, and then the needed structure after that. Over to BRAC just a little bit. You mentioned that the last BRAC is still not even paid for yet to break even. Can you tell us what is, or who is, the validating function that says, okay, DOD, you're going to save this much money, but it wasn't recognized? I would assume that there's got to be some trade, some talk and discussion to say, okay, we all agree that's what you can save, but obviously we've not realized that. How does that work?
Mark, that's a great question, and yeah, we have to agree on the metrics and the integrity of how it's measured and how it's defined and what it consists of, and so you're not comparing apples and oranges. All of that's critical. A lot of it has to do with construction. When you do a BRAC round and you bring troops to Fort Carson, and we have extra additional brigade combat teams here, then we need extra barracks and buildings and facilities and headquarters. And so there's a huge, which I'm all for, and I've supported that, and we've seen great construction here at Fort Carson, but that's an expense. That's the kind of expense that you have in a BRAC round that goes into judging what the cost is. A lot of it really hinges on construction. So, but yeah, you're making a great point. We do have to define it. We have to be on the same page. But I'm going to agree with you first that let's get the strategy first, and that's got to come first.
Thank you.
Okay, how about one more, and then the next panel, which we'll get ready to go. Yes, sir.
Congressman, I just would like your opinion as to why you feel the department is not using the other closure or realignment authorities that they currently have. It would be my premise that they understand the tools that the BRAC process brings to communities. There's substantial funding, OEA support to help communities deal with closures, whereas the other authorities that the department has don't have such vigorous tools available to them. And I think the departments understand that they have excess infrastructure, but they're not willing to use those warm basing tools and other closure modalities because they know communities will go crazy on them. So can you speak to that? Do you have any insight?
Well, actually, you've already explained in your question / comment. You did a great job. Just the commander-in-chief saying, hey, we don't need this this base in, Alaska, let's close it down tomorrow. That's a blunt instrument that Congress wouldn't like, the communities wouldn't like, there'd be a big political uproar, and it probably wouldn't get very far, and there'd be a bill to reverse that, and there'd be strong supermajorities to override a veto, and so the decision won't go anywhere. And you're right, under BRAC, because it's defined, there are all these other ancillary steps that help the communities work out the process. And yeah, you're exactly right. So that's why we haven't seen it. It's there in theory. And I think in a time of crisis or a time of real severe need, we might see some of that happen. But yeah, in normal operations, we won't do that. We'll go through the full political process. And BRAC is a good process in that regard. Members of Congress agree. They won't amend it. They'll just do an up or down vote on the whole package. And there is advantages to it. It is a great concept and makes something happen that otherwise would get so bogged down in debate and amendments and delays it would never materialize. Hey, thanks for letting me be here this morning.